They told me it was just a small violation, a patch of paint, a fence an inch too high, a fee that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But then, the letters started piling up. The threats got bolder. And before I knew it, the place I called home turned into a battlefield. Imagine opening your front door every morning and wondering, what will they try today? A notice taped to the window? A fine for something you didn't even do? Neighbors whispering because the HOA painted you as a troublemaker. This wasn't about rules anymore, it was personal. And when I pushed back, when I refused to bow down, they struck harder. They came after my family, my property, my peace. I thought I owned my home, but suddenly it felt like I was just a tenant in a kingdom ruled by people drunk on power. But here's the thing. They underestimated me, and they underestimated what happens when you push a homeowner too far. So when the HOA made their final move, I made mine. And what happened next shocked the entire neighborhood. The question is, whose side will you be on? For years, life in Maplewood Shores seemed picture perfect. Families waved as they drove past, kids raced bikes down cul-de-sacs, and lawns were trimmed so evenly it felt like something out of a magazine. At the heart of it all was the Peterson family. Mark, his wife Anna, and their two kids, Emma and Jacob. Mark worked long hours at his small business downtown, but every evening he'd pull into the driveway of his two-story brick home and breathe easier. The lake shimmered just beyond the backyard, and the porch swing was his favorite place to watch the sunset. Anna loved gardening, bright tulips in spring, roses climbing the trellis in summer. Their home wasn't extravagant, but it was theirs, and it radiated warmth. Neighbors often stopped by to borrow a tool from Mark or taste Anna's fresh-baked bread. On weekends, the Petersons hosted barbecues where the whole block gathered. Kids splashed in the lake, parents laughed over cold drinks, and for a while, it felt like nothing could disturb the harmony of this little neighborhood. But beneath the surface of all that perfection was something less visible. Maplewood Shores had a strict HOA. Rules about fence heights, mailbox colors, even the kinds of curtains visible from the street. Mark didn't think much of it at first. That's just how these communities work, he'd tell Anna, brushing off the occasional letter reminding them about trash bin placement. Most neighbors complied quietly, never wanted to rock the boat. Still, there were whispers. Quiet grumbles about board members who seemed to watch too closely, who enforced rules with one family while ignoring the same issue across the street. Mark noticed, but shrugged it off. Until one spring morning when Anna planted a row of sunflowers along the side of the house. She loved how they reached for the sky, bold and bright. A week later, a letter arrived. Not a friendly reminder this time, but a violation notice. According to the HOA, the sunflowers didn't meet approved landscaping standards. At first, Mark laughed it off. Sunflowers? Really? Surely it was a misunderstanding. But that letter was only the beginning. Soon, the Petersons noticed cars slowing down in front of their house. Neighbors they'd once chatted with avoided eye contact. Another notice followed, then another, each one more aggressive than the last. What started as a peaceful family home was beginning to feel like a target. And while Mark tried to stay calm, Anna couldn't shake the unease. Why them? Why now? The Petersons didn't know it yet, but those simple sunflowers had lit a fuse. The HOA wasn't done with them, far from it. And the battle that was about to unfold would turn their dream neighborhood into a nightmare, testing loyalties, friendships, and what it really means to own your home.
At first, Mark thought the sunflower notice was laughable, just a minor hiccup in an otherwise peaceful neighborhood. But within days, a second letter arrived. This time, it wasn't about flowers. It was about their mailbox. According to the HOA, the Petersons' mailbox wasn't painted in the approved shade of forest green. Mark walked out to the curb and stared at it. The thing was practically brand new. It's green, he muttered, running his hand over the smooth paint. What else do they want? But the HOA wasn't interested in explanations. The letter ended with a warning. Failure to comply may result in fines and further enforcement actions. It was the tone more than the words that got under Mark's skin. Cold, unyielding, threatening. Anna tried to brush it off. Maybe they're just picky, she said, though her voice carried more worry than confidence. But then came the fines. First $50, then $100. By the end of the month, they were staring at a bill for nearly $300 over a mailbox and a few sunflowers. Mark decided to attend the next HOA meeting. He walked into the community center expecting a reasonable discussion. Instead, he found himself facing a panel of stone-faced board members sitting at a long table like judges. One of them, a man named Richard, read off a list of violations in a clipped voice. The Peterson residence is in violation of Section 4B regarding approved flora. Additionally, Section 7A regarding mailbox standards. Failure to remedy these issues in a timely manner will result in continued fines. Mark raised his hand. With all due respect, these are minor things. Sunflowers? A mailbox color that's still green? No one else seems to be fined for this kind of thing. Richard didn't flinch. We enforce the rules equally, Mr. Peterson. If you feel singled out, that's a matter of perception, not fact. The room was silent. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, some staring at their shoes, others exchanging quick glances. No one spoke up. No one defended him. Mark left that night more frustrated than ever, and that's when the real harassment began. One morning, he woke to find a bright orange sticker slapped across his front window. Violation! Immediate attention required! He peeled it off with shaking hands, his kids watching from the doorway, confused and scared. Another day, he received a certified letter claiming he owed over $1,200 in accumulated fines. The number seemed impossible. How had it escalated so fast? Mark called the HOA office demanding answers, only to be told the board was not available for comment. Then came the rumors. A neighbor casually mentioned at the grocery store that they'd heard the Petersons weren't paying their dues. Another asked if Mark was in some kind of trouble. The same neighbors who once borrowed his tools now avoided his gaze. It was clear. The HOA wasn't just going after his property. They were going after his reputation. Anna was distraught. We can't keep living like this, she whispered one night as they sat at the kitchen table, unpaid bills spread between them. It feels like they're trying to push us out. And maybe that was the plan. The Petersons tried to comply, repainting the mailbox and trimming the sunflowers, but each time they fixed one issue, a new violation appeared. A garden hose left in the yard, a trash bin visible for too long. Even Emma's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were deemed graffiti. It didn't matter what they did. The board had made up their mind the Petersons were the enemy. By summer, things reached a boiling point. One Saturday morning, Mark walked outside to find a tow truck backing into his driveway. His truck, parked neatly in front of his garage, was being hooked up for removal. "What are you doing?" Mark shouted, racing toward the driver. "HOA order," the man shrugged. "They said it's parked in violation of community standards." "In my own driveway?" Mark barked. The driver just handed him a slip of paper and kept working. Mark yanked out his phone, recording the entire ordeal, his voice shaking with rage. Neighbors peeked through curtains as his truck was hauled away like some kind of trophy. That night, Mark didn't sleep. He sat in the dark living room, fists clenched, replaying the video over and over. Enough was enough. The next day, he started digging. He pulled out HOA bylaws, financial records, anything he could get his hands on. And what he found left him stunned. Hidden in the fine print were vague clauses that gave the board sweeping power. They could fine, tow, even place liens on properties for repeated noncompliance. But what disturbed him most were the numbers. The HOA's budget showed thousands of dollars in administrative fees, with no clear explanation. Was this really about rules or about money? Mark decided to fight back. He contacted an attorney who confirmed his worst fear, that if the fines continued unchecked, the HOA could legally foreclose on their home. Anna broke down in tears. They could take everything, over flowers, over our mailbox. But Mark's grief turned into determination. Then we're not going down quietly.
He started attending every meeting, armed with documents and questions. He recorded videos, shared his story online, and slowly, whispers turned into conversations. Other neighbors admitted they too had been targeted. One family fined for leaving bikes in their yard, another for planting an unapproved tree. Even Emma's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were deemed graffiti. It didn't matter what they did. The board had made up their mind the Petersons were the enemy. But just when it seemed like momentum was shifting, the HOA made their boldest move yet. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Anna heard a loud crash outside. She ran to the window and froze. A crew of workers, hired by the HOA, was tearing down the family's wooden fence, without warning, without permission. By the time Mark rushed home, half the fence was gone, splintered boards piled on the lawn. A board member stood nearby, arms crossed. "This fence was not in compliance," he said coldly. Mark's face burned with fury. His children stood crying behind him, clutching their mother. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't just about property lines or fines. This was war. The Petersons had been pushed to the edge, but the HOA had just crossed a line they could never uncross. And what Mark did next would shake the entire neighborhood.
The day after the fence was torn down, Mark woke up with a storm raging inside him. He looked out at the splintered wood still scattered across the lawn, a jagged reminder that the HOA no longer respected boundaries, literal or otherwise. This wasn't just about fines anymore. This was about control, about humiliation. And Mark knew if he didn't push back now, he would lose everything: his home, his reputation, his peace. That morning, he made a decision. He wasn't going to play defense anymore. It was time to go on the attack. Mark called his lawyer and laid everything on the table: the harassment, the fines, the fence. His attorney listened quietly, then leaned forward. "Mark," he said, "what they're doing isn't just excessive, it's illegal. You have them cornered. But you'll need to fight this in the open." Mark's stomach tightened. He wasn't the type to make public scenes. But then he thought about Anna's tear-stained face, the way Emma had asked, "Daddy, are they going to take our house?" And he knew there was no choice. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. The Petersons weren't the only ones fed up. Rumors of other unfair fines had stirred the neighborhood into curiosity, even anger. People wanted answers. Mark walked in with a binder under his arm, heart pounding. Richard, the board president, sat smugly at the head of the table, flanked by the other members. He barely glanced up as Mark took his seat. The meeting dragged on with petty agenda items, parking spaces, lawn decorations, until Richard finally announced, "Next, the Peterson case." The room went quiet. Richard cleared his throat. "As you all know, the Peterson residence has been in repeated violation of community standards. Despite multiple warnings, fines, and corrective measures, they remain non-compliant. As of this month, the total owed is $8,450. If unpaid, we will proceed with lien and foreclosure action." Gasps rippled through the room. Anna squeezed Mark's hand under the table. Mark stood. His voice shook at first, but he steadied himself. "With all due respect, Richard, that's not the full story. And tonight, everyone here deserves to hear the truth." Mark opened his binder and began laying out evidence. Photos of the mailbox repainted to the HOA's exact color code. Receipts proving the fence had been approved years earlier. Letters from neighbors who had received no fines for similar violations. He projected the HOA's budget onto a screen, highlighting unexplained administrative expenses that totaled tens of thousands of dollars. Where's this money going? Why are families being drained over technicalities while these so-called fees pile up with no accountability? Murmurs swept through the crowd. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his once calm facade beginning to crack. Mark pressed harder. He played the video of his truck being towed from his own driveway. He displayed photos of the demolished fence.
He even read aloud a section of the HOA's bylaws that directly contradicted their so-called authority to order such actions. Every word stoked the room's energy. Neighbors who once looked away were now leaning forward, whispering, nodding, glaring at the board. And then Mark dropped the final bombshell. "I consulted with an attorney," he said, holding up a thick packet of legal documents. "Not only are these fines baseless, but this board's actions constitute harassment and abuse of power. If you move forward with foreclosure, you won't just be taking my home, you'll be facing a lawsuit. And it won't just be me. Anyone here who's been targeted will have grounds to join." The room erupted. People shouted, demanded answers, called for resignations. One neighbor stood and yelled, "They fined me $500 for leaving my trash can out one night. This is robbery." Another chimed in, "My kids can't even draw with chalk without a violation notice." The board members exchanged panicked looks. Richard slammed his gavel, his voice cracking as he tried to restore order. "This meeting is out of control. Sit down, Mr. Peterson." But Mark didn't sit. He locked eyes with Richard. "No," he said firmly, his voice echoing through the room. "For too long, we've all been sitting down. Not anymore." Richard's face reddened. He leaned forward, spitting words like venom. "You think you can intimidate this board? You think you can undermine the rules that keep this community running?" Mark didn't blink. "I don't need to undermine the rules, Richard. I'm exposing the way you twist them for power." For the first time, Richard looked rattled. His voice faltered. This is slander. None of this holds weight." But Mark had one more card to play. He handed copies of financial documents to the crowd. "Then explain why thousands of dollars in HOA funds have been funneled into a private account under your name." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as people surged forward to look at the papers. Richard went pale. That's a misinterpretation." But no one was listening. The crowd had turned. Board members whispered frantically, distancing themselves from him. Neighbors who once feared speaking out were now shouting for a full audit, for Richard to step down, for the board to answer for every dollar. It was chaos, but for the first time, chaos not aimed at the Petersons. Richard banged the gavel again, desperate. "This meeting is adjourned," he barked. But the room didn't disperse. People were standing, yelling, demanding justice. The power he'd wielded so easily for years was slipping through his fingers in real time. Mark looked around at the faces, angry, fed up, awake, and felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just fighting for his family anymore. He was fighting for everyone. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Richard, your time controlling this neighborhood is over. Tonight you answer for what you've done, or we'll take it to court and to the press. Either way, the truth is out." For a moment, Richard said nothing. His hand trembled around the gavel. Then, with a sharp crack, he slammed it down and stormed out of the room, his authority shattered. The board scrambled, promising transparency, vowing to review the finances, even hinting at Richard's resignation. Neighbors surrounded Mark, clapping him on the back, thanking him for standing up when no one else dared. Anna hugged him tightly, whispering, "You did it." But Mark knew it wasn't over yet. He'd won the battle, but the war, the audits, the lawsuits, the rebuilding of trust was still ahead. Still, that night, as he walked out of the community center, the cool air hit his face, and he felt something he hadn't felt in months: relief, vindication. The HOA tried to break him. Instead, they exposed themselves. And as Mark looked back at the building, lights still blazing, voices still echoing inside, he realized this wasn't just his victory. It was the neighborhood's awakening. Because when you push ordinary people too far, they stop being quiet. They stop being afraid. They fight back. And sometimes they win. But as the dust settled, one question remained. What would become of Maplewood Shores now that the truth was out.
The meeting that night ended in chaos, but for the first time, it was chaos that worked in Mark's favor. Neighbors who had once turned their eyes away now stood beside him, demanding accountability. Richard had stormed out, his authority crumbling in front of everyone. But as Mark and Anna walked back home under the cool night sky, they both knew the fight wasn't completely over. The HOA wasn't a single man. It was an entire system of rules, power, and control. And tearing down one corrupt leader didn't erase the damage already done. Still, something had shifted. For the first time in months, Mark felt a flicker of hope. The next week, whispers spread through Maplewood shores like wildfire. Word of Richard's shady financial dealings had leaked beyond the neighborhood. People were talking at the grocery store, at the school pickup line, even at Sunday church. Within days, Richard resigned. No dramatic speech, no farewell, just a short letter slipped into mailboxes claiming personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. The remaining board members scrambled to repair their credibility. They called for a special election to fill vacant seats, promised an independent audit of HOA finances, and suspended all fines currently in dispute, including every single one against the Petersons. When Mark pulled the official notice from his mailbox, he just stood there on the curb, staring at it in disbelief. Anna came up behind him, reading over his shoulder, and let out a shaky laugh. "It's over?" she asked. Mark shook his head slowly. "Not over," he said, "but it's a start." At first, neighbors were cautious. Some had been silent too long, afraid to speak against the board. Others still carried resentment, not sure who to trust. But little by little, something remarkable began to happen. One evening, the Petersons received an unexpected knock on the door. It was Mrs. Daniels from down the street, holding a casserole dish in trembling hands. "I should have said something sooner. They fined me from my shutters last year. I was scared. I didn't stand up like you did. But thank you for fighting back." Then came the Johnsons, sharing how their son's basketball hoop had been ordered down under safety violations. The Lees admitted they'd been threatened with foreclosure over a late HOA fee. Story after story poured out, and with them a sense of community that had been missing for years. The Petersons realized something powerful. By standing up, they hadn't just saved their home. They had given their neighbors permission to stop being afraid. When the results of the independent audit were released, they confirmed what Mark had suspected all along. Thousands of dollars in HOA funds had been siphoned into consulting fees and special projects that led back to accounts tied to Richard. The revelation sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. What had once been brushed off as petty fines and nitpicking suddenly looked like part of a larger scheme, an abuse of trust that had hurt everyone. The board voted unanimously to pursue legal action against Richard, seeking restitution for the stolen funds. For many neighbors, it was a moment of vindication. Justice wasn't just a concept anymore. It was in motion. With Richard gone and new elections on the horizon, the community began to transform. Meetings that had once been stiff, one-sided affairs now turned into open discussions. Neighbors voiced concerns without fear of retaliation. Rules were revisited, with the most restrictive and unreasonable ones struck down. The Petersons, to their surprise, were asked if they'd consider running for the new board. Mark hesitated. After everything, did he really want to step into that world? But Anna reminded him that real change only lasts if good people step up. So Mark accepted, not out of ambition, but out of responsibility. He wanted to make sure no one else endured what his family had gone through. At the first meeting under the new board, Mark looked out at the crowd, faces that once glared with suspicion, now glowing with cautious optimism. And for the first time, he felt like Maplewood Shores could be what it was always meant to be, a community, not a battleground. For the Peterson family, healing came slowly. Emma and Jacob no longer asked if they were going to lose their home. Anna replanted her garden, sunflowers included, this time with neighbors helping dig the soil. And Mark, though still carrying the scars of stress and sleepless nights, found peace in small moments, watching his kids race bikes on the street, hearing laughter drift across the lake, feeling the weight of fear finally lift. The fence was rebuilt, stronger than before, not just wood and nails, but a symbol of resilience, of taking a stand, of refusing to be bullied in your own backyard. Mark often reflected on the ordeal, how a few sunflowers had sparked a battle that nearly cost him everything, how silence from others had made him feel isolated, but eventually his voice gave strength to many. He realized something profound. The HOA hadn't been powerful because of its rules. It had been powerful because people surrendered without question. The real change came not from paperwork or policies, but from ordinary families refusing to stay quiet. And that, Mark believed, was the lesson worth remembering. Months later, Maplewood Shores was different. Rules still existed, trash still had to be picked up, lawns maintained, but they were applied fairly, with flexibility and understanding. Instead of rigid enforcers, the board became mediators, neighbors helping neighbors. When disputes arose, they were resolved with conversation, not threats. The community grew closer, block parties returned, kids chalked sidewalks without fear of fines. The Petersons became symbols of resilience. People pointed to their fight as the moment Maplewood Shores turned a corner. And though Mark never asked for the spotlight, he carried the respect with quiet dignity, always reminding people that it wasn't about him. It was about everyone standing together. As for Richard, he faced both legal consequences and the weight of public shame. His name became a cautionary tale whispered at HOA gatherings across the county. For him, the empire built on fear had crumbled, leaving only ruins. For those watching, the story of the Petersons wasn't just entertainment. It was a reminder, a warning even, that ordinary people can be pushed too far, and that sometimes the most powerful act is simply refusing to back down. Because whether it's an HOA, a workplace, or any system that thrives on unchecked power, silence is what allows abuse to grow. But courage, messy, imperfect, trembling courage, can turn the tide. The Petersons' battle began with sunflowers, but it ended with something far greater, a neighborhood learning to live without fear. So as the sun set over Maplewood Shores months later, Mark sat again on his porch swing, watching the golden light dance across the lake. The garden bloomed, children's laughter echoed down the street. For the first time in what felt like forever, it was peaceful again. He turned to Anna, who was sipping tea beside him, and smiled. "We almost lost everything," he said softly. "But maybe in a strange way, we gained something bigger." Anna nodded, eyes on the sunflowers swaying proudly in the breeze. "We found out what we're made of, and so did everyone else." Because in the end, the real victory wasn't just in saving their home. It was in proving that even against the strongest walls of power, truth, unity, and resilience can break through. And that's a fight worth remembering.